Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now in our second season and more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on energy production, an overview of the landscape. And as we start out this month's series on energy production, we want to focus in on the good, the bad, and the ugly as it relates to the environment. Our every move is utterly dependent upon inexpensive and abundant energy. Without it, today's society would just absolutely grind to a halt. And this is particularly true in the U.S., where the per-person oil, gas, and natural gas consumption is the most of any country, accounting for approximately 21% of the entire world's energy production. And this dependence on fossil fuels that most societies are experiencing is growing increasingly problematic. When it comes to energy, there, however, is no free lunch. It would be foolish for us to assume that transitioning to renewable energy will solve all of our energy and environmental problems. Transitioning to renewables will certainly diminish some of our ecological impacts in many ways, but it will also have new and mostly unknown consequences. A full-scale switch to renewable energy could merely supplant one dependency for another. The global economy requires a massive, uninterrupted flow of energy every single day, the vast majority of it currently in the form of fossil fuels. And these non-renewable energy resources are constantly depleting, so we must continually find and successfully exploit new sources so that tomorrow we can meet the same demand as we did today. This is a lot. Here today to help us unpack some of this and try to understand it more is Kit Kennedy. Kit is with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Kit leads the NRDC state and regional climate and clean energy advocacy work across the U.S. and has more than 30 years of experience as an environmental and clean energy attorney and advocate. Kit directed the Environmental Protection Bureau at the New York Attorney General's office from 2007 to 2010, and she's taught environmental and clean energy classes at Yale Law School, at Fordham Law School, and Vermont Law School. Kit serves on the board of the New York League of Conservation, Voters Education Fund, the Alliance for Clean Energy, New York, and the executive board of the New York State Bar's Environmental Law section. Kit is also a member of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and she is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Harvard College. And she is based in New York with NRDC's New York office, and she's in Brooklyn looking at all the snow. Welcome, Kit. We're so glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Bernice. I'm really excited to be on the show.
Kit, we want to start out by having you describe for us how you see our energy production landscape right now, that is globally and across the U.S. And would you go ahead and describe for us what you see are major sources of energy production, how much of it is produced and used, and who uses it?
Yeah, so that's the big question, Bernice, and let me try to jump in. And of course, we use energy in many different forms in our everyday lives. We use electricity whenever we turn on the lights and in our stores and businesses. We use oil, gasoline when we drive our cars for the most part. We use energy in industrial processes. So you're right, energy is super important. And I think the good news, and I always sort of try to focus on the good news and the solutions, although we'll get into the bad news too, is that energy production, and in particular electricity production here in the U.S., is getting cleaner. We're on a good trend, although we need to do a lot more to address the health impacts that you discussed and the climate crisis. And we're doing better, I would say, in two important ways. One, we're using electricity and energy overall much more efficiently. So the light bulbs that we use, our air conditioners, our dishwashers and clothes washers are much more efficient than the ones we used when we were a kid. And the cars that we drive are more efficient. So we're doing more with less energy, and that is great news because all forms of energy production have environmental impacts, and also because when we can use less energy to do more, our energy bills can go down, and that's really important too. So looking at our electricity mix here in the U.S., today we get about 20% of our electricity from renewables, mostly hydropower, but also increasing amounts of wind and solar. We get 20% of our electricity from nuclear power. And just under 25% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power plants, and the use of coal-fired power plants is on a downward trajectory, which is good news for a variety of reasons. And the rest of our electricity needs come from natural gas-powered power plants. So that electricity mix is less dependent on fossil fuels than it was 5, 10 years ago, much less dependent on coal, but use of natural gas for electricity production is going up. So our electricity mix is getting a bit cleaner, and that is good news, but we have a long way to go.
Let's talk a little bit, though, about natural gas. And I know it's better than coal, but where does natural gas intersect with fossil fuels?
Right. So natural gas, and these days we call it fossil gas or fracked gas,
yes,
is a form of fossil fuel.
Right.
It comes, we're extracting gas from the earth, these days using mostly a technique called fracking, hydraulic fracturing. And you're right, Bernice, natural gas is less carbon intensive than coal or than oil, but it is still a fossil fuel. It still has carbon impacts and an array of health impacts, both when it is burned to produce electricity and when we extract it from the ground. And I think there's a pretty universal consensus that between now and 2050, and 2050 sounds far away, but it's not really, we are going to have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels for almost all or all of our energy usage, and be much more reliant on low carbon energy sources.
And we have about a minute to go before we need to go to shout-outs. But I just want to review and summarize, Kit, in terms of the energy production and those things that are going into producing our electricity, with the worst being coal. Coal is being minimized very much so, though. What is it about the percentage of coal use? We finally got that.
Just under 25%, yeah. And down from, it was 50% in
right.
my lifetime. We're still using a lot of coal, so that is still a remaining challenge. And also transitioning workers and communities in coal plants, around coal plants, that's really important too, so that we're being fair to those communities, providing a just transition.
So coal is bad, number one. Next is oil.
Oil is a very, very small part of our U.S. electricity mix. Mm-hmm. But in terms of our overall energy mix, of course, we use a lot of oil for transportation and other uses.
Now, what's about the percentage of oil? Well, I know it's not 100%, but it's predominantly used oil, gas for transportation. And what percentage would you say for electricity?
Oh, it's really only hovering around 1 or 2%.
Then natural gas is?
About just under 40%.
Okay. So that gives what percentage in general for renewables?
20% of our electricity comes from renewables, wind, hydro, and solar, and about 20% from nuclear power.
Okay, that's the good news, and we'll talk about that much more on the other side. We've been with Kit Kennedy from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you so much. We want to give our shout-outs now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, or the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many other locations, as well as available online free for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and education, supplies, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, and looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show on energy production, overview of the landscape, and we are back with Kit Kennedy with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Again, thank you so much for being with us today, Kit. And you were just giving us the rundown and the overview of energy production and utilization in our country. We left off with you telling us that renewables are at about 40% of our electricity usage.
Yeah, so just to be clear, so renewables is about 20%, and then nuclear power is another 20%. So you could group those together as low carbon, yes.
And that's 40% of electricity, and then out there still is all the tons of energy that we use and produce that are in our automobile.
That's right. And transportation today is the number one source of carbon pollution in the United States. It used to be our power plants, our power sector, but as our power production has gotten cleaner and low carbon over the years, transportation is kind of the big number one source of carbon pollution. So we also have to take a lot of actions to make our transportation systems much cleaner and healthier.
Indeed. On Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, we do a whole month of shows on transportation and air pollution, and because of its big impacts. So I just kind of wanted to cover that as we talk about the energy production landscape and overview, but we want to move on now and kind of dig more into that sector of renewables, and want to talk about what is the good part or the good news about our energy production and energy use right now. And in my mind, it is the fact that we are indisputably and irreversibly on an upswing towards the use and utilization and recognition and respect of renewables.
The good news about renewables is you can have small-scale renewables. You can put solar panels on your roof. You can have community solar, which different people in the community can tap into. And you can also have big, large-scale solar, wind, and offshore wind projects. And Bernice, as you probably know, Texas is a leader on wind energy. So Texas is, still producing, of course, a lot of oil and gas, but right up there on the wind energy front, which is really exciting and good news.
It is. And, you know, one of the things that it really makes my heart sing in relationship to Texas and our local energy, AKA used to be oil energy companies, is that they are all investing in renewable energy. They now realize that they are not in the oil energy business only, but they are in the energy production and very much embracing, and all the big companies are now serious players in the renewable energy field.
That's absolutely right, because the future is really going to be about renewables. And today, there's just a growing explosive growth in clean energy jobs, both on the energy efficiency side and on the renewable side. You know, unfortunately, during the last year, during the COVID-19 epidemic, we've had a terrible economic problem accompanying the health problem. So there's been a bit of a dip in the clean energy job sector. But as we recover, we're going to see that come back. And we do see oil majors like BP, like Shell, investing in renewables, both land-based and offshore wind, because they're following the future trends, they're following the jobs, and that's super exciting to see.
He recently passed, but one of our legendary Texas oilmen, T. Boone Pickens, was one of the early adapters and investments in wind farms. So that makes a real big difference.
Right.
Kit, just go back and explain to our listeners about hydropower, what it is, how it gets them electricity and gets the lights on.
Sure. You know, hydropower is a source of clean electricity that we've had in the United States, you know, for well over 100 years. And here in New York, for instance, in New York State, we have Niagara Falls up at the Canadian border. And since the 1930s, we've harnessed the power of those falls to create electricity here in New York State. And there's a lot of hydropower in the Northwest as well, and different regions of the country. So it's about taking you know, either natural waterfalls or creating waterfalls, you know, via dams, harnessing the power of that water to turn a turbine and create electricity. And of course, you know, as you mentioned at the very start, all forms of energy production have some environmental impact. There is no free lunch other than from energy efficiency.
Yeah.
And so hydropower can create impacts on fish and impacts on wild ecosystems. So we have to try to make sure that those hydropower projects are in the right place and operated correctly. But hydropower is a big source of renewable electricity in the U.S. still today.
About what percentage, and is hydropower more geographically focused?
It is, let's see, of the 20% that are renewables, I would say just over half of that is probably from hydropower and the rest from wind and solar. I think as time goes on, as we see more growth in renewables, that growth is going to come from wind and solar rather than from hydro, because hydropower is sort of limited by natural resources like water, whereas wind and solar, I mean, they're dependent on the natural resources too, but there's wind and sun almost everywhere in the United States.
That must be why we are excelling in wind here in Texas, because we don't have a lot of bodies of water here.
That's right. That's right. So I think the renewables growth that we're going to see is mainly going to be in wind and solar. We may be able to produce hydropower more efficiently and also get more hydropower from smaller projects.
Moving on to the bad, somewhat, you mentioned that there are some consequences to everything, and you talked about hydropower. What are the consequences for wind, solar, and nuclear?
Yeah, so for wind and solar, it's mainly about siting them in the right spots, being very careful and thoughtful about that siting process, and also coming up with operating procedures that are going to minimize the impact on the environment and ecosystems. So just one quick example, wind turbines, when we first started using them in the US decades ago, we hadn't done all the thinking that we have today about how to make sure that birds aren't impacted by wind turbines. And there were some examples of projects that did cause damage to bird species. Today, wind developers are much more sophisticated, and regulators, state, city, federal regulators have thought much more about siting. And so between putting them in the best places and having the best operating protocols in place, we've really minimized the impact of most wind projects on birds. Solar, we've also got to get the siting right, make sure that we're not upsetting ecosystems. For instance, when we put solar in the desert, again, there's a very good learning curve here, and we're learning how to make sure that renewables don't have significant negative impacts. And part of it is just doing the whole environmental review before you build a project, looking ahead, doing the planning, doing the environmental review.
We've had some rollbacks and some setbacks over these last few years. So talk to us about the environmental consequences of that and what you see on the horizon. And then two of the next best things you think that ordinary people can do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions.
So very, very quickly, the Trump administration tried to roll back and undo almost every bedrock environmental and climate policy. That's the bad news. NRDC sued the Trump administration well more than 100 times and won most of those lawsuits with our partners. And the really good news is that the Biden administration is raring to go on climate with a focus on health and clean energy jobs and climate justice, and they're bombing ahead to restore those policies and to put new ones in place. In terms of what everyday people can do, make sure that you're using energy and electricity efficiently in your homes. Make sure you've got all LED light bulbs in there, and vote. When it comes time for elections, look at the candidates' environmental and climate records and make sure that you're voting for climate champions, because we need climate champions in our cities, states, as well as in Congress and, of course, the presidency.
Indeed. As the news people always say, elections matter. Thank you so much. We've been with Kit Kennedy with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We really appreciate your help today, Kit, as well as the NRDC being a great friend and resource to this show. Thank you so much, and we'll have you again, if not you, many others from NRDC this year. So we're going to close out this section and go to break, and on the other side, we're going to talk with Professor Todd Cowen, an on-the-ground person about engineering as it relates to energy production and utilization. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Thank you, Bernice.
Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. And we're back with our show on energy production, looking at the landscape, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The United States became the world's largest producer of crude oil in 2018, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia. And our natural gas plant liquids production, which is a component of all liquid fuels production, set an all-time high also in 2018. The combined increases in crude oil and liquid natural gas production, coupled with our sophisticated and plentiful refining capacity, has led the U.S. to become a major exporter of crude oil and petroleum products. However, although imports have declined, the U.S. will continue to import crude oil in order to meet the specific needs of many of our U.S. refineries. The United States will remain a net energy exporter through 2050 as increases in domestic crude oil, natural gas, and liquid natural gas production continue to outpace growth in domestic consumption of petroleum products. We're familiar with oil-rich regions here in Texas, but technological advances have created a means of extracting these resources in new regions of the country, injecting billions of dollars into local economies and spurring really almost a modern-day gold rush. At the same time, the U.S. is experiencing an oil and gas boom. Market forces are transforming U.S. energy systems toward clean, renewable energy that was once touted as a vision mostly by environmentalists only. Now these energy resources are shared by market purists. Today, as we discussed earlier, renewable energy resources such as wind and solar power are at price points that are literally driving coal production and coal-fired generation of electricity out of business. Here to help us to understand and explore this more in this section of today's show is Professor Todd Cowen with Cornell University. Todd is the director of the DeFries Hydraulic Laboratory and served as the Katie Dwyer Marble and Kurt Marble Faculty Director for Energy at the Atkinson Center for Sustainability at Cornell from 2013 through 2018. Todd got his PhD in civil engineering at Stanford University, specializing in environmental fluid mechanics. His research interests are environmental fluid mechanics, renewable energy, and sustainability. Todd has worked with the parent company of the New York State Electric and Gas Corporation to create, test, and optimize new residential electric storage systems as part of the Energy Smart Community initiatives. And this cutting-edge academic and private industry initiative also he worked with as it relates to the National Science Foundation. He has a wealth of experience in integrating renewable energy sources, reducing household electricity costs, and empowering homeowners to reduce their greenhouse emissions. Welcome, Todd, and did I get all of that right?
It's great to be here, Bernice, and that was a brilliant introduction. Thank you. I think you perhaps oversold me, but I'll do my best to live up to your expectations.
Thank you, Todd. Todd, we want to start out asking you, similarly as we did with our guest on the last segment, but you all come to it from different perspectives and different areas of expertise, but that is, how would you describe our energy production landscape right now? That is globally and in the U.S., and then go on and describe for our listeners what are our major sources of energy production, as you said, and how much of that production is used geographically and in various sectors of our economy.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it, and I'll focus mostly domestically because I'm more familiar with that front. But as you are just articulated, we're at an interesting place in U.S. energy history in that we now produce as much energy as we consume. We still import energy and export energy, but we have historically, for me and perhaps for you, we're raised in a period where we looked to OPEC and others to produce energy and import it into the U.S., and we've had many a political group tell us that we want to become energy independent.
Now, let me ask you something right there, and I hate to interrupt you, but this has always been a source for question for me. We are energy independent. We produce more now than we use. We actually export it. So why are we still importing?
That's a great question, and I think it has to do with the energy mixes that we need. I'm not really an expert in the breakdown, but in general, we need certain forms of energy, of fuels, at certain times of the year in certain locations. And for instance, right now, we are in an explosive growth through hydraulic fracking in generating methane. And we're talking about liquefying some of that methane and exporting it worldwide because demand in the U.S. for liquefied methane is below world demand, below U.S. consumption. So we have excess, and so we're looking to export it. So it's a matter of balancing our energy needs with our energy production. So the forms aren't all exactly as we need them, but net, the total amount of energy we produce is about what we need, just not always in the right form.
So it sounds like to me that that has to do with the energy production infrastructure, because I know it has to do with refineries and the input there. that is the reason that we're having to still import energy.
I mean, we're a fossil fuel based economy still. We are transitioning toward renewable energy. We're also transitioning toward electrification of our energy sectors. So we think about energy as multiple sources. You asked about sort of how it breaks out across what we do, but certainly electricity production is a major piece of the energy we need. But for those of us who live in the Northeast, like myself, we have to heat our homes. Some of us heat with electricity, many don't. But we are electrifying heating going forward. There's a real opportunity for gains in reducing our carbon footprints and actually reducing in our energy bills by doing that. But because of that historical infrastructure built around refining fossil fuels, in particular oil and derivatives and natural gas, we do have an incredible refinery capacity, and we have a border with Canada, which is an incredible fossil fuel exporter as well. So there is a large flow of hydrocarbons through the U.S. Refinery processing, and some of which gets consumed locally and some of it gets exported.
I have to think, too, that is one of the elements that is pushing in terms of us getting to more and more clean energy, is that we have this big old infrastructure that's already set up, costs a lot of money, and it's bigger than a lot, and it's still set up, and its profit is based upon bringing that oil in to produce electricity. And that's pushing against the lighter weight, I like to call it the more gazelle-like renewables that are pushing and that are environmentally more friendly and safer and better.
I think you're exactly right, Bernice. And I think one of the things we're seeing certainly play out nationally now is those that are interested in seeing the transition we need to have happen. Basically, as you've said, by 2050, we need to be off fossil fuels. And how do we get there? Well, if we have large corporations investing in incredibly significant capital infrastructure projects, like any of us, if you're going to
pipelines,
exactly, that's where I was heading, and export ports, you expect to have 30 to 50 years to recoup your investment out of that infrastructure. And if we look at the timeline projection of even just 30 years, that puts us beyond 2050. So there is increasing pressure on government and company and policy to not invest in capital infrastructure around fossil fuels, but to shift that investment toward renewables. And we are seeing, that play out. We saw it in the Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations around particularly large pipeline projects. From my perspective, the good news is we now have, again, a federal policy that at least respects that investment in significant infrastructure projects around fossil fuels is not the pathway forward. And so I'm hopeful that that will become federal policy permanently, but we are at the whim of voters. And hopefully we all as a country start to realize the importance of this to everybody's future and the multiple generations to come.
And so now in the last, 4 or 5 years, we've seen that major pipeline be approved and now be disapproved or stopped.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, the Obama administration shut it down. The Trump administration allowed it. So there were 4 years where it was moving forward. And on day 1 or day 2, I forget which, the Biden administration has again pulled the federal permits required for the major pipeline.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back on the other side of the break. We've been with Professor Todd Cowen with Cornell University. We'll be right back. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV service. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available for download free online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our segment, the last segment on today's show on energy production, overview of the landscape, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're back with Professor Todd Cowen with Cornell University. And Todd was just talking to us about a lot of the capital infrastructure and investment, which has been driving us to perhaps not a full realization of renewable energy's benefits to our society and our environment. So, Todd, I want to move on a little bit now to more about the good story about our energy production right now. So, from where you sit, what is the good? You mentioned we are producing energy more efficiently and costs are going down. Of our renewable or clean sources out there, perhaps which is the least expensive and which is most efficient and which is safest? Three things.
Well, I'll do my best to take a stab at sort of dancing across all of those, Bernice.
Okay.
First of all, I think it depends very much on your geography. You know, when you have sun, solar can be great. I live in Ithaca, New York, where we have what we like to call the opaque skies for half the year. And so solar is still a good resource here, but it may not be a great resource. But we have plenty of solar installed, and it works for us. And then, of course, if you have good wind, like you do in much of the plains of Texas, it can be a great resource there. Wind is in such excess. I remember a year or two ago, they were actually paying people to use wind energy at night because the price went negative at night due to the interesting opportunities in markets when you have excess supply versus demand. So it very much depends on where you are and seasonality of the year. So in terms of efficiency, they're all getting more efficient. Solar is a really interesting one, as we have seen prices fall by factors of 10 and 100 really in the past 20 years, partly due to efficiency gains. We now can capture about 24, 25% of the sun and convert it to electricity, so an efficiency of about 1/4 at scale, at commercial scales. What people are doing in the labs and research institutions like mine are even better than that. And so there are hopes that we will get to technologies that will exceed 30%. And so that's great, which just basically means a smaller physical plant can generate as much energy as we generate on a larger plant now, or the same footprint of land could generate more energy than we presently generate. Wind is the same. We're seeing a push to offshore wind. The advantages of offshore wind are many. As you mentioned, my area of expertise is environmental fluid mechanics. Wind is stronger offshore than on land, simply kind of due to friction. You haven't got trees and buildings and mountains in the way, so it blows unimpeded over the water, and you have pretty strong temperature differences, which can drive very big winds. And so that's one reason we do better with efficiency offshore. Another is that we can go very, very big offshore. It turns out you can get to very, very large scale towers offshore, and those large scales are scales of economy. Just like you build a bigger power plant with traditional fossil fuels, you can generate electricity for less cost per unit fuel. And so the unit fuel in wind energy or solar energy is, of course, sun and wind respectively. It comes for free. So if we can capture more of it per unit, we end up generating electricity at smaller costs. And so there are huge opportunities in decreasing costs for both solar and wind, and we're seeing that continue to play out. Solar is probably getting close to the point where the majority of the cost now is really in the infrastructure. The panel itself is relatively small.
What is the infrastructure, really brief, for solar?
For solar, basically it's racking, right? You've got to put the rack and the grid, and you need some infrastructure to convert the direct current electricity. So it produces electricity much like a battery direct current, and our houses, of course, use alternating current, AC. So you need some infrastructure to regulate the voltage level and convert it to the right type of electricity, the right form, this alternating current or AC that we use in our homes.
And I also hear about storage.
Yeah, storage is huge, and it's one of the critical challenges we face in the electrification of our energy use these days. So as most of us know, one of the huge advantages to fossil fuel is I can fill up a little, jerry can or gas can and put it in my lawnmower. My car runs out of gas, go into the gas station, throw it in my car. I can store 15, 20 gallons in my car, and I've got all the energy I need to drive 400 or 500 miles. The challenge with electricity is we don't have as an efficient storage system yet. The battery is our storage for electricity, and batteries traditionally have relatively low energy density, meaning the amount of energy that I can put in a battery is less per unit mass or unit volume, which leads to these very heavy battery packs in cars and the range anxiety that many people are concerned about in cars. The largest range on most cars is maybe 300 miles. The battery pack for that weighs much, much more than a 500-mile range of gasoline in a similar car. So we're still making progress on storage, and that's where maybe the largest leaps still need to come to let us move beyond some of the limitations we see in electric transportation.
Right there, Todd. I have to think this is a society that has gone to the moon and back, and some other places way out there and back. So I have to think it's only a matter of time and for us to apply ourselves to create and invent those technologies. At one time, a computer like my laptop here took up a whole room.
Exactly.
Now it's on my watch.
You are 100% correct. And in essence, I think we've hit the tipping point already. When you have a 300-mile range car that, by the way, you can pull over now and charge in 30 or 40 minutes back to full or 80% of full, we've already gotten to the point where we're over that hurdle, and we're seeing the acceleration of the adoption of vehicles. To me, one of the great news stories in the last week is General Motors.
Yep.
Right? 2035, we're going to see General Motors stop selling fossil fuel cars. That
was amazing
milestone, and not one that shocks me in the sense of technology. We've had that technology to say that probably for 5 years now or more. It's a business decision that is surprising, and I think it's a sign of the direction we're heading and the wins people see, the headwinds people see against the climate, and it's time for corporate America to not only take responsibility, but to hopefully, from their perspective, I think they're hoping to get out ahead of policy and not have the government dictate to them the timeline, but they to be able to set a timeline that's ambitious but achievable, and that could make a significant difference to climate change.
And it is. And I, Todd, also publish a Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living monthly magazine. And it's been like probably 8 to 10 years ago, I went to this big media event for Ford's 150 electrified truck. And so I've seen them making and rolling out and dealing with electric vehicles for a long time now. And I've also talked to dealerships, local and regional dealerships, and they had them. The cars didn't sell a lot because nobody was interested, and so the dealerships weren't putting a lot of effort into it. But we're seeing all of that pick up a lot. And like you said, with public policy behind it, it's exciting. And it was so exciting for GE to come out with that announcement, less than 10 days into the new administration, which meant they'd been working on it and thinking about it all along.
Exactly.
Really briefly, because we only have 2 minutes to go, but I want to take 1 minute and you explain to us a little bit more about tapping into the heat in the core of the Earth. We've all heard about that, if no more than basic high school science. But just really briefly, how does that happen and like you said, get delivered to our homes?
Sure. So we're not quite, core is a bit extreme on my part to say. We're going down about 3 kilometers, maybe a little further. But as we go down in the Earth in general, the temperature gets hotter. And so the trick to find is in your local community is how far do you have to go down to hit a use of heat that is functional, in our case, for heating, say, a campus community. So we need to get to about 150, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And it turns out locally for us, that's about 3 kilometers. It's not like being in Yellowstone, where you probably could go down a few feet and hit those temperatures. Here, 3 kilometers, given the ability of drill rigs from the fossil fuel industry to go that deep at fairly reasonable cost, makes some sense. And so we will drill down that 3 kilometers. And then if it all works out, the goal will be to pump water into one hole, recover it in a second hole some hundreds of meters apart. And that recirculated water would get heated as it goes through the ground over those few hundred meters, and then exchanged in a heat exchange facility, much like the radiator in your car, into a loop on campus that distributes that hot water around the individual buildings. So the water in the earth would never contact the building energy loop. It's a non-contact system, and it would be essentially closed loop and would not take extra water once we fill the pipes with water.
Thank you, Todd. That was a very excellent explanation, is that it's going into the earth, being heated while it's down in the earth, pumped back out as heated, and then used as energy. I love that. Thank you for such a cogent explanation. Last thing, Todd, before we go. What would be your parting words to ordinary folks out there about what they can do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to our energy production and usage problem from where you sit?
Sure. Number one, vote for people that are interested in supporting energy at the local, state, and federal levels. A lot of the change that's happening nationwide right now is being driven at the local and state level due to the past administration's lack of policy. Hopefully the new federal administration will have a national energy policy, but we've not seen that in the past, so I'm not necessarily sure it's going to happen in the future. Number two, look at your transportation. Can you minimize your vehicle trips? Do you need to make one trip for everything you do? Can you do 5 trips all at once? Number three, as you start replacing things in your house, think about the energy efficiency. In particular, if you're heating your house or cooling your house, look heat pumps, ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps. It's the electrification of the heating in your house. I think, Bernice, you said it earlier, if you burn it, it's a fossil fuel and it's polluting the air and doing all kinds of things for our climate. Can you heat and cool your house without burning anything? That's your goal.
Thank you so much, Todd. We really appreciate your help in unpacking this. We've been with Professor Todd Cowen from Cornell University. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your homes, in your social circles, your workplaces, and at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout lines, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. Each of these tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Todd, and join us again for next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio as we continue to explore energy production. Thank you. Bye, Todd.
Bye. Thank you.